live with Diandra from Bilingual Play Date. I am so excited to have her on. We were just talking about how speech pathologists and social workers just have this thing. We just have this thing. So I brought her on today. So that way, I mean, honestly, if no one has seen her labor of love, Bilingual Play Date, please go ahead and go to Instagram and check it out. Diandra, what you are putting out there is fabulous, and it's so helpful to the bilingual community, to service providers who really don't know what it's like to be bilingual, or even what it's like to support parents raising bilingual children. And so excited to get into what we're going to talk about today.
Yay! I'm so excited too. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me here. I do believe that, you know, all of us who are in the helping professions or service providers to families that are diverse, that are linguistically diverse or multicultural, like I think social workers, SLPs, you know, school psychologists or psychologists, and like we all need to be working together because we all seek similar things, I would say, and it can be very impactful when we do kind of collaborate and have that multidisciplinary team.
Well, Diandra, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background?
Yes, I would love to. So my name's Diandra Morse. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in New York. My family is from I was raised in the Dominican Republic. I was born in New York, raised in the Dominican Republic, and then immigrated back to New York as a teenager. But I've traveled back and forth between Dominican Republic and New York my whole life. So I'm very much like a bicultural and bilingual child. I actually learned English. My family stayed for like 2 years in New York City. My parents were working on becoming United States citizens, and so we stayed in the U.S. for 2 years. And so I am the child that a lot of speech pathologists would see, or a lot of people working in schools would see, as someone who didn't know any English as a 6-year-old, enter second grade because I had already completed first grade in the DR. And so I feel like slowly my life experiences are why I'm here today. But one of the things that I remember is how well all the service providers that were in my school served me. Like it wasn't, you know, like my school is in a very predominantly Dominican American neighborhood in New York City. So Washington Heights, shout out to Washington Heights if anyone's on here. But so it was very easy. I think like my transition, it wasn't like shocking that like I spoke Spanish and didn't speak English yet. So I think that experience just being so positive in how I learned English. And then my experiences that came after that really led to me wanting to. My mom always says this. She's like, oh my God, when you were little, you were always like, oh, I want to speak more English so I can help people who are Spanish speakers be able to advocate for themselves. And I kept always saying that, like, I want to continue learning. I want to grow. My grandmother lived in New York. And so I always said, like, oh, if she ever needed help with like the doctors, because not everybody provides a translator, I was always like, oh my God, I would love to be able to help her, you know, with that. And I just always had that in me. Like I wanted to advocate. So at first I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And then eventually I was like, well, I don't know if that's like my personality. And so when I was in college, I learned about human services and I learned about social work. And that's how I slowly gravitated into my career and decided that I wanted to be a social worker. When I was in grad school, then there was an opening at an agency in New York called Advocates for Children of New York. And they had an opening for a social worker who wanted to work with immigrant students and their families. And the whole project was to help them navigate the education system. And so that's where my like career began, in school advocacy. And wanting to kind of do this work. But I did take a break in between and did sexual abuse treatment. I still do that. But I did sexual abuse treatment for a while. And then when the pandemic hit, that's when I started being more of a parent, like on the parent side of bilingualism. I had a 1-year-old and I wanted to really pass down my language. And then Bilingual Playdate came to existence, because I was like, oh, I want to do it, but I want to do it in a fun way. I don't have a lot of resources. I'm the resource, for my child. I live in a predominantly English speaking community. And so how are we going to do this? And that's how Bilingual Playdate was born. It was kind of like parenting, my own experiences, my advocacy, my social work experiences all coming together.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that background. One of the main things I thought about was that position that you took up in grad school and how that must have just been specifically curated for you, Diandra.
I literally felt that. I was like, I remember vividly my friend Macy, who was an intern at this agency, messaged like our whole class. And she was like, oh, my job is looking for a social worker who's Spanish speaking to work with immigrant students and families. And I remember like replying in seconds, like, I'm in, here's my resume. And I had an interview that Monday following. And then after that, I feel like that set me on this course.
So you did mention a little bit about working with sexual abuse. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in that arena?
Yeah.
Bilingual in Spanish speaking populations as well?
So it's so I live in Syracuse, so it's in the Syracuse community. So it's for, well, I worked for an agency before where that was like our predominant work. So we did sexual abuse prevention, and it was prevention, and it was also kind of like a reactive program because the kids were already identified as victims of sexual abuse or engaging in sexually acting out behavior as a result of either trauma or whatever was kind of going on in their life that did not necessarily teach them appropriate like boundaries or ways to relate to others that did not include sexual behavior. And so I did that for 6 years, and I loved it. And I still do that privately now. So I have a private practice and I do that. So Bilingual Playdate is not like a therapy forum. So I get my therapy, I still flex my therapy muscles, like privately, but Bilingual Playdate is more like advocacy and education, which is always something that I love doing. And I was missing because my sexual abuse treatment in the program, it was more one-on-one, like more group therapy. There wasn't as much advocacy in the community or virtually, which I love that Instagram provides like a venue for us to be able to do that. But I still love it. And I still bring a lot of that information into Bilingual Playdate in that April is Sexual Abuse Prevention Month. And so I shared like books and resources that parents can use, because the thing about bilingualism that I don't think a lot of people talk about is that parents don't need help as much with like, oh, this is rojo, that, like they don't need like the simple vocabulary necessarily. They need like the social vocabulary, the social context. Like, how do I talk to my child about body safety in Spanish? How do I talk about sexual abuse with my child in Spanish? Most of us know how to have those conversations somewhat in English, but we don't know how to have them in Spanish because maybe that wasn't our norm or our parents didn't talk about that. And in schools, we learn that information in health class, sorta. We learn it in English, but we don't learn that in Spanish. And so for a lot of first, second, third generation children, it stops being as meaningful. The language stops being as meaningful because the social conversations that are really important are being had only in English. And so for me, that's one of the things that I want to keep going on in Bilingual Playdate is like, how do we, this is a lifelong journey. Like I want to have those conversations in Spanish with my kids, like my parents had with me in Spanish, but how do we make that accessible for everybody to be able to do that? That's the hard part.
Thank you for the work you're doing. Because what's coming up for me, Diandra, is I'm just picturing a child who didn't, they're learning about sexual education or maybe even how to advocate for themselves, which honestly, I don't know about you, but I didn't have that growing up. I mean, we had sexual education. We learned about like the menstrual cycle and everything, but we didn't learn about how to advocate for ourselves against sexual abuse or anything like that.
No.
Explain what's wrong, maybe explaining when we're hurt, but not really. And so I'm thinking about someone who might be trying to defend themselves from a perpetrator who only speaks Spanish.
Right.
Because that's their community. And so how do you know how to do that? So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
for the
I love doing this work. I just love it so much. It's such a need and it's so taboo. And I feel like that, I mean, we always say this in sexual abuse treatment, like silence breeds more sexual abuse. So a lot of times families don't want to talk about things because they are fearful that it's going to like plant a seed. But when we don't talk about something, that's where the danger becomes like arises versus if you make it a normal conversation, like my kids know private parts. They know like they can't touch other people's private parts. No one can touch their private parts. Like we have that on lockdown since they were babies. I was just like, nope, this is private. We go to the bathroom to do this, like every, and so a lot of us didn't have that. I mean, I had some conversations more when I was already like an older teenager, but as a child, we didn't have those conversations that could have prevented any kind of harm that came my way. If that harm came my way, like I don't know, a lot of kids just don't know. They don't know that they need to report this. It doesn't always feel unsafe what's happening, so they don't know that they should say something. And so I love doing that work, and I think that I'll forever do that work, even though I never saw myself doing that work, because it's just so needed.
I will be definitely asking you to come back for another episode just on that topic alone.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yes, please. So let's talk a little bit more about the Bilingual Playdate page. You do have that other passion of yours, which is talking about the invisible mental load on bilingual children. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired that and some things that you found?
Yes. Oh my God. So the invisible mental load of bilingual parenting and then bilingual children, it's such a passion for me. I think that that's when at first I used to share like a lot of ways to play with kids, and then that's when I started being like, but it's bigger than play. Like it's bigger than just like connecting with your kid, because there are things that sometimes get in the way of us feeling connected to someone or to our children or connected to a language. And so I was like, what are those things, or what are those worries that I have, that I know other people may have, that we're not just talking about it? And then it was during the pandemic that I started having those thoughts, because I would see all the time the invisible mental load of motherhood, the invisible mental load of fatherhood. And then I'm like, yeah, I get it, but I don't identify with that fully. I identify with like bilingualism is such a core part of my parenting that motherhood alone wouldn't capture what I'm feeling. And so as the pandemic started kind of progressing and things started opening up, that's when I started feeling it more, because we had full control of our Spanish immersion environment in our home. And then you open the gates and it's like English is coming in all left and right. The kids are going back to school. And that's what kind of made me think like, oh, wait, but there is like a mental load, but it's just for bilingual parenting. But also as a bilingual child, when you have to constantly navigate a world that's not bilingual like you are, and a world that doesn't understand your language needs like you understand them, a world where you have to be your advocate because your mom can't be at school with you all the time. And so I started thinking about and having those conversations with my 4-year-old, who is genius. He's like he's just a genius. And so I started having those conversations like, oh, how do you feel when you have to speak English instead of Spanish because someone else you're trying to communicate with someone and they don't speak Spanish, and so we started having those conversations, and I started kind of like documenting some of the things that he would say, and then I started opening it up more to the community, like, what are your kids saying? What are they worried about? What is their experience? What was your experience when you were a bilingual child? And then I started kind of putting it in a visual form, and it was very representative of how people were feeling. And so now I love like just talking about it. Like it's there. We don't always feel safe to share it. But it's there. And my hope is in talking more about it is that providers start asking those questions. Like, how does it feel to raise your child bilingually? What are the barriers that you're encountering? What are the thoughts and fears that you're having? What are you worried about? How can I help? And then put themselves up for, I'm here if you need help with this.
2 questions that are going through my mind. First, can you actually kind of explain what a social worker does? What's the scope of your job?
Oh my God. So, okay. So social workers, we wear many hats, but there's many venues that you can go into for school. So like when I went to school, I chose a track that allowed me to do community problem solving. So like be an advocate in the community, boots on the ground kind of work.
Mhm.
And then also work towards becoming licensed so that I could do one-on-one therapy, or I could do therapy like in a higher education. I could do therapy at a school, in an agency. And so some social workers can do both things depending on their licenses. Some other social workers can go into like administration. We form programs, we run programs, we evaluate programs. We can be in education kind of roles where we're teaching people about social skills or parenting skills. So we can kind of go into any direction and do it all. But the core of our profession is that we meet our clients where they're at. So, like, we do a needs assessment. So, we meet someone, we ask them what is it that they're struggling with, not what we think they need, but what they're struggling with and how we can serve them. And so, that's kind of always, that should always be the role of a social worker, to want to assess what the need is and then provide what they can depending on their expertise. And if we can't, then we are trained to collaborate, to reach out, to connect people to the resource that they need.
Because one thing I'm thinking about, for example, when it comes to needs from the speech pathology side, we might ask a parent, well, what are your needs? And they'll
Mhm.
say, well, my child doesn't talk. My child only utters 1 to 2 words and they're 4 years old. My child doesn't play with any children. So, what sorts of needs would a parent say to you as a social worker that you'd be able to take on?
Yes, they could say, my family can't afford groceries. We have a very hard time with rent right now. And so, like, a social worker would be able to help with that, would be able to look up what local programs or what benefits locally or statewide the family would be able to take advantage of, depending on, the criteria of said program. A social worker would be able to look for housing opportunities for this family, or evaluate the safety of the housing conditions that the family is. So, like, let's say a family could say, my landlord is abusing their power and they're not doing what we agreed upon. Then the social worker and would be like an advocate for that family in helping them navigate that. And so that's why it's so important, even like as a bilingual social worker, I've done that for people. I've been able to connect them to programs, because a lot of times our families who are monolingual Spanish are not very well versed. I mean, monolingual English people are not well versed in programs that are available to them anyway. But imagine if you just moved to this country, this is like so foreign, it doesn't even look like the country that you came from. And then you have to navigate these programs that you don't understand why they would be good for you, or what does it mean? Is there a catch-22? And so a lot of what social workers do is we do a lot of research. We're up to date on like the programs that are available, and we connect families to those programs, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, I always think about that. Families can be their best selves if their basic needs are not met. And so, like, we can talk about speech to death, but if the family isn't eating, like, that's not going to be the priority. If the family doesn't have stable housing, we cannot, like, that is not possible. We need to make sure that their basic needs are met. So, like, an SLP that came into a home and noticed that the cleanliness of the home, or the lack of, like, notice something that was alarming, it would be wise to connect with someone that could help that family get their needs met, so that other services can actually make progress.
Wow. That was so powerful. And I know since this is something that you do for profession, it's like, well, of course, I mean, this is what a social worker does.
Mhm.
But to be honest, Diandra, I'll be completely transparent with you. I knew social workers worked with families directly, but I really did not know exactly how you helped families. So thank you
Mhm.
for bridging that gap for me.
Yeah,
Um,
you're welcome.
I
I think a lot of people don't know. I think we have a bad rep on our profession having history where we have taken kids away from families, and I think a lot of people see that and or remember that, because how could you not? But
Mhm.
that is not at all like the scope of the profession. The profession really is to advocate. We were involved, like, the history of our profession, we were involved with like disability rights movement, like all the advocacy, all major changes, social workers have been involved in that. And it is a requirement of our profession. Like the other day, I did a continuing education credit, and I was asking them, I was like, well, sometimes I get nervous because I advocate very harshly, like online and very openly. And she was like, the woman presenting, she was like, oh, don't worry about that, because it is a requirement of our profession now that we are strong advocates for the families that we serve, and staying silent is not wouldn't help anyone. And I was like, okay, that's a good reminder.
Yes, and you mentioned how there's like that bad stigma for social workers taking children away, and
Mhm.
I have to apologize because that was another thing I thought of as far
Mhm.
as what social workers do. So I thank you for even addressing that stigma in the community, because when
Mhm.
we're working with Black and Brown children specifically, that's a lot of the challenges that
Yeah.
they go through.
Yeah, and I don't blame it. I mean, I think that being a social worker, and being a parent now, I feel like my lens is just wider. Uh, it would be it would be intimidating if anyone came to my house and like was asking questions about my kid, wanting asking questions about me. Like it would be intimidating, because our nature, like when you have a child, that's your life, and so you're trying to protect it as much as you can. And so when someone is questioning that, I understand why parents would have their guard up and would think like, oh, is this person going to take my kid? Like that is normal. And I think the part that doesn't build trust is when we don't acknowledge that it's normal. Like it's normal to be distrustful. Like why should you trust a stranger that came into your house that's telling you to do things differently, or you that's the mental load. You think you're doing something bad, and this person it's going to teach you now. So now it's a lot. Like now you're like, wait, did I do this to my kid? Like it's me. Am I the problem? What is going on? And so I think that we don't do a good job as providers sometimes in acknowledging that it is normal that you don't trust me right now. I hope that with time you will trust me, and you will see that I am here for the best interest of your family and your child, and I'm going to be here to help you guys get to wherever you need to get within my abilities and my expertise. And if I can't help you, I'm going to find someone that can. And I feel like we don't say those things enough. So like families are guarded, especially because we have done that. We have removed kids from their homes, and so how could you not be guarded? But it takes a lot of humility, I feel like, to be able to talk about that, and then also acknowledge that, yeah, it makes sense. I would be nervous too.
And so that makes me want to ask, so are there any specific counseling strategies or anything you do to build that trust? Because I know that you mentioned even just having that conversation, like, look, I know that trust has to be earned. I'm just here to
Mhm.
help you. We can build trust over time. That's fine. Just know I'm here to help you. And then of course you'll follow up with with the actual action. But do you have a story maybe of when it was a bit more challenging than just the conversation, what you did?
Yeah. Okay. So, this is so fun. Um, okay. So in sexual abuse treatment, I worked with predominantly kids who did engage in sexually abusive behavior, with someone. It could be an adult or another child or someone else, but my kids are the best. These were my kids, right? And so we were trying to figure out like why did this happen? And obviously when sexual abuse is disclosed, a family has many reactions to it. Rightfully so. It is something that's very big and shocking, and you would be worried, and you are like you are just be beside yourself that this happened in your family. And so I had a lot of parents who didn't necessarily understand the treatment, like why, because a lot of times when you think about sexually abusive behaviors, you think about adults, and then you think about adults belong in jail. Like they're a pedophile and they should go to jail. But it's not the same way when a child acts in a sexually abusive way. We have to get to the root cause. But there's still that stigma that like, oh, maybe they don't belong in society. And so having to do that work. And so a lot of the work that I would do with parents, it's like, okay, I just want you to meet with you for 10 minutes. And, you don't have to participate. You don't have to say anything. I just want to tell you about the research, what the research is saying, why it's different when kids sexually act out versus when an adult engages in sexually abusive behavior. And I would give them a lot of education. I would do a lot of so like on my Instagram, I do a lot of visuals and graphs and things like that. And so this is the same way that I do my therapy. I would give handouts, and if you wanted to learn more, I would always give parents resources. If you want to learn more or learn on your own time, here's a great book that you could read. Here's a great article. And I feel like, and then I would love to know your opinion. I value your opinion. I want to know your takeaways, even if you think that they're not going to be the same as mine. I really want to know what you think, because then we can have a better conversation if I know what you think. And so always just kind of putting the parent as the expert on their kid and on their life experience has always been a really great way for me to build rapport with a family and gain their trust. And then also following through with what I say. So like if I say I'm going to come to a home visit, and like we also do home visits as a social worker, I forgot. But if I'm doing a home visit and I said I'm going to be there, I'm not going to cancel them last minute, even if, unless it's an emergency. But if like something happens in my life that seems more fun, I'm not going to cancel my client, the home visit. I'm going to follow through with the home visit. If I say I'm going to meet with you for 10 minutes, I'm going to meet for you for 10 minutes and then let you know that the 10 minutes are up. And if you want it, would you like to continue to talk to me, or would you like me to meet with your child? And so a lot of questions like that, I think, have really helped me build rapport with families who other people might think of them as resistant or like unwilling to like chat with me. And I'm like, well, why would they want to chat with me? They don't know me. Like, you have to learn. I mean, and I think sharing things about you, that are relevant to the conversation progressing, not like disclosing and making the session like about you, is not a way to build rapport. But I think acknowledging that it is weird that you're here, and it is uncomfortable for me when I meet someone for the first time to talk to them about the worst thing that has ever happened in my family. Right. Who would want to do that? I mean, I don't want to do that. I don't want to tell a stranger the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I don't want to tell. Sometimes it's hard to tell your friends the worst thing that has happened to you. Why would it be any different just because I'm a therapist? What does that even mean for people? I like asking, what has your experience been in therapy to people? Or what have you liked about your therapist before? What didn't you like? Because those questions allow me to know what the client's experience has been and how that's going to impact the work that we do together.
That is very powerful, Diandra, because I just keep thinking about this particular population. Bound. We do not like expressing what's going on. What happens in the home stays in the home. How do you break through that barrier as a service provider? And it's just like what you said, is having them be the expert rather than us. I think about, I actually you were on an episode with the Bold SLP Collective. And so I know when I got to speak with them, we talked a lot about family-centered care and how a lot of the trauma that comes with specifically even the bilingual population or people who come into America and work with service providers is we like to kind of hold our heads high as if we are the expert, as if we know everything there is to know. But honestly, no, the bilingual people are the ones who know more about their language, their home, their culture and everything. So yeah. Thank you for those strategies. I know that you are a breath of fresh air for a lot of people listening right now.
Yay, thank you.
So just some more questions. I do actually want to go back to that invisible mental load. What are some of the, I guess, questions that parents have posed or have told you, some of the challenges that they face when it comes to being Spanish speaking in the United States?
Yeah. Well, one big one that a lot of people always fear, worry about, it's like, will, if I only speak Spanish to my child, will this cause a delay? Delay for their English later, which no, it doesn't cause a delay. This is a myth. Or if like I'm raising a child where the dad speaks English and the mom speaks Spanish, will that cause a delay? Are kids able to like learn two languages at the same time? And the answer is yes, you can. But there's a lot of misconceptions around bilingualism, and so that weighs heavy. People worry a lot about speech, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I've connected with so many speech therapists on Instagram, is because there's a lot of worries around speech, but then there's a lot of worries around academics. There's a lot of worries about social like interactions, like what does it look like if we're a Spanish speaking family and then we go to the playground but everyone is speaking English? Like, should we switch our languages? Can we stay in our own languages? And I always think about it not only for my kids, but I think about it for myself. My parents don't speak English and they don't need to. They've never needed to. And so I have never felt any kind of way. Like, to me, that's just, I go to the, if I, when I went to the playground when I was little, I spoke Spanish to them, and then I spoke English to the rest of the world that was there. But it never occurred to me that like my parents needed to learn English, or like I needed to speak English to them so that they could learn. And so that's kind of how I operate. I'm like, I would never ask my parent to change their language or to try. It's not necessary. And so for kids to like expect that of them, or to put that pressure on a kid to like no longer speak to their family member, that is to me what are like, to me, preserving the family relationship is number one. And so when parents are talking about, oh, my speech therapist or my doctor said you need to practice more of the strategies that we're doing in therapy in English at home, to me that's always like so surprising, because I'm like, but the parent doesn't speak English. Like, how can the parent actually help the child if they don't speak English? Wouldn't it be more appropriate if the speech therapist told the parent how to do that strategy for Spanish, so that the parent could replicate still the same process, but for a different language? Like, that is possible. Or, you know, the pediatrician wants the parent to do, or the teacher wants the parent to read, but in English at home. Why can they read in Spanish? It's the same skill. We're reading. Like, that's the action is the same. The language doesn't really matter. And so a lot of the conversations that parents bring up is that it's that the social pressure. And even if someone isn't telling you, it's just like the looks and the looks and the change in attitude, or the posture, or the constant, well, what are you guys saying? What are you guys talking about? And I'm just like, if you needed to know, I would let you know. Like, my child is asking me to go pee. Do you really need to know that? Like, you know, if, and you can tell what a kid is asking their parent by the way that their body language moves. And so and sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe it's just because I'm a therapist, I just like know the body language and stuff. But I'm like, no, like, if you look at a child, you know, if they're going like this, you know that they want to be held. They want you to pick them up. Like, they're very physical communicators. And so if you really want to know what a kid wants from their parent, look at what they're doing. If they're pulling their parent, if they're pointing, like, that's the conversation. You don't need to know word for word what the parent is doing, but there's a lot of people wanting you to either switch to English or translate for them. Oh, what are you saying? What are you saying? And it's just like, guys, you don't need to know for us to all like be together. And so that's kind of like the mental load. And then for kids, I think it's like not knowing, especially when they're alone, when they're with their parent, the parent kind of asserts that like, this is what's going to happen. But when they're alone, there is that pressure to like almost hide or repress that side of them, because they don't want to have to answer. They see their parents constantly having to answer and constantly having to like set boundaries, and kids just kind of want to be. They just want to blend. They don't want to always just be the difference, you know, or be seen as the difference, you know. I was just having this conversation with a parent that, and I made a post about it, like how exhausting it is when someone compliments your kids' English skills constantly, because I'm not complimenting my kids like skills, because it's just like they're speaking. I'm not going to be like, oh my God, your Spanish is so great. Your Spanish is so great. My kid doesn't even know that that one at some point he didn't speak. My kids don't know that. They don't remember being a baby. They just know that they communicate, but there's like this constant praise for children who were Spanish dominant are now acquiring English skills. It's like this constant praise, but it's more like, oh, I didn't really think that you were going to ever speak English, so now I have to let you know how great it is. And then it puts you then in a situation where then now you have to praise Spanish so that your kid sees that it's equally valuable. But it's just like a weird way of communicating, because I would never tell someone like, oh my God, how great is your English, when it's their only language. And so for bilingual kids, both languages are theirs. And so they don't need to be complimented on these languages that were always theirs. It just doesn't make any sense.
Ooh, wow. You're shaking a lot of tables right now.
I know, I'm getting in trouble. Someone's gonna be mad. That's fine. This is what I like about.
Well, speaking of communication and language, and honestly just celebrating bilingualism rather than shooting it down. I mean, to be honest with you, I am surprised that other speech pathologists, pediatricians encourage doing take-home homework or carryovers in English rather than their home language. Not to shame anyone, but really, yeah, but frankly, it just does them a disservice. It just does them a disservice. And so how would you say that speech pathologists can work better with social workers to bridge these gaps and uplift bilingual communities?
Yeah, I think that a lot of assumptions, sometimes we all carry a lot of assumptions and biases of what we think our clients need to be doing based on what we learned in school, and based on like in general, like the longer you're in a career, the more you think you know, but you don't really know, but you think you know. And so I think I would love to see more asking the family what are their goals for their child's speech, what are their goals for their child's communication in X language, communication in this language, who is it that they're going to be using these languages with, and how important is that relationship, like how, and then doing more education in that terms for families. Because one of the things that I feel like no one ever says to families is that in the United States, if you're raising a bilingual child in the United States, what makes your child bilingual is the language that's not English. They're not bilingual because they speak English, because English will always be there. They're going to school in English. Bilingualism is not the norm in our country. It's not the norm in our schools. So your kid is likely going to an English dominant school. Even if it's dual immersion, it's still going to be English dominant. The majority of the people are going to be well versed in English over the other language that they're targeting. And so what makes your child bilingual is the fact that they speak Spanish, that they speak Hindi, that they speak German. It's not English. And so focusing on English is doing a family like telling the family to, as a provider, you have to focus on the language that you can provide, right? But for the family, not letting them know that it is the preservation of that language that their family speaks that will make their child bilingual is a disservice for the family. And it is a disservice because their child is more likely to be English dominant and have very minimal Spanish skills, or more conversational Spanish skills, than professional if it's not nurtured from the beginning and continues to be nurtured, And the older we get, the harder it gets. Like, I think about like learning a language is very hard. It takes time, it takes practice. And the older you are, the more stuff you have to do in life. And so if we want more bilinguals to be in our society in the future, we need to tell families, focus on your language. We got the other one. That's how we collaborate. We got English, you got the other one. That's what we need to be doing. But I don't know.
You're like, but I don't know. But no, that was very powerful advice.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that people get that fully, that like it's not, because when people think about bilingualism, they're still stuck in the old ways of thinking where it's like, oh, it has to be 50 this and 50 this. It's never 50. It's never 50% of English and 50% of Spanish. It's never, because even if your child is in dual immersion school, when they leave that school, their entire world is in English. So it's always disproportionate for English. And so English will always tip the scale and the other language gets left behind. The older kids get, and the more they are in our communities. And so the more we say that, the better it is for our families. But I think that we are very hesitant to call it out like it is, because we are also English preferring and biased to speaking English, because we also know that that is the language that people respect more in the US, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just thinking about so many other things from a clinical perspective. But Sally, we are almost out of time. I have 3 questions that I want to ask you before we go.
Yes.
There is a certain population that is really heavy on my mind, and those are the parents who you've mentioned come in from out of the country.
Mm-hmm.
They're sending their children to school a lot of times, like preschoolers sending their babies to school. And so, what would you say as far as counseling and intervention goes? So, we talked a lot about building trust, but even just about making them feel welcome in this country.
Yes. Oh my God. I love this question. I would love it. These are the things that I would love in our
Mhm.
world. I would love that if I'm working with a family who came from the Dominican Republic, and I know that I would love for whoever, for me as the provider, to learn about the country, learn like on my own, like find time, carve out time to learn about your clients' culture, your client's language, your client's music. And I would love the incorporation of that. So like, for example, I know that, well, no, because speech therapists also do one-on-one sessions with their clients. And so like for me, I do a lot of one-on-one sessions. I used to do group work too, but one-on-one is where how I connect the most now with my clients. And like one of the things that I do to build trust, but also to get to know my clients, is like I invite my clients to bring to session 10 songs. And I work with a lot of teenagers too. So I'm like 10 songs that you would say, like, when that song comes on, you're like, man, that song, and it takes you back to something super special, super important. And music, you don't really need to know the language of the music. Like, you don't need to understand. The beat communicates to you the feeling that your client is getting from that song. You can look up the lyrics and you can Google Translate. Like, there's so many, like, we have the technology to be able to be more invested in our families' lives and learn more about them. There's literally no excuse, but music is so telling for me about a client's mental state, feelings, like what they're connected to, and then we can bond over that. And so I feel like speech pathologists could do the same thing. They could ask, what is your favorite song to the child? What is your favorite song to the family? And then tell them, I want to, or what was your favorite song growing up? And if someone asked me that, I'd be like, oh my God, let me show you. And then I would tell them so much about me from one song. Like, I love this song because my dad used to play it when we were driving to school every morning. And every time I hear it, I think about my dad. And I think like that, I think knowing fun facts about the country, families like that. Like that's like, oh my God, this person went out of their way when they didn't need to learn something, to then share it with me, or I was at a in the community and I noticed that there are 2 Dominican restaurants here. Have you ever been? If I go, what should I eat? Like, ask the family to teach you about them. Would you recommend this? Oh, that's not the typical place that people go. Tell me about the one that people go. I want to go to the one where the people go. And having those conversations, like humanizing ourselves. I feel like sometimes providers want to be like robots, or like, I don't know, like, oh, I'm here, Miss Professional or whatever. And I am just like, guys, like, we need to also be people so that we can connect, because when you have the connection, like in therapy, they say the strategy matters less, the connection matters more. So like the therapist's ability to connect with the client matters more than the strategy that you're trying, because you could be the best therapist with the best strategy, but if you're not connecting with that client, your best strategy isn't working.
Right.
Yeah.
You have something on your page that says connection is the heart of bilingualism. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I love that. So yes, I believe that connection is what makes bilingualism possible. So if we don't have a connection, like for me, when I was a kid, I knew that I was Dominican American. I was born in New York. That was my connection. Like I knew that I was going to be an English speaker, and my parents were Dominican, so I was going to be a Spanish speaker, and I was going to be bilingual from the get-go. I just knew that. And so for me, that was my connection. And then I knew that my grandma didn't speak English, and so I always said that I was going to take care of her. So I'm named after my grandma too. So we have a strong connection. And so I was like, oh, I'll take care of you when you're older. I'm going to be there for you. And so I knew that part of it was like, okay, I need to continue to be bilingual. I need to continue to speak Spanish to communicate with her because she doesn't speak English and she's not going to learn. And I need to learn, like, continue my English skills so that I can do that. And so for me, it was always like, it was about the connection with my grandmother that was going to get me through my bilingual journey. That's who I was connected to, and that's who I wanted to do it for. And so my kids have my mom, the same thing, like my mom, their grandma, as the connecting factor, and my dad. These are the people that they are now maintaining their bilingualism for. And I think having a vivid picture is the heart of bilingualism. Like who you love or what you love is who you become bilingual for. And so my husband, when we never spoke Spanish to each other. I knew he knew a little bit, but we never used it. And we met in college. So I've known him since he was 19. I was 17. And so when we had our first son, I told him, like, well, I'm going to speak Spanish because I need my kids to be able to communicate with my mom and my dad. And like, I just cannot imagine if they can't. And his connection became being connected to his family, who was me and our first, speaking Spanish all the time. And so the connection to connect with us was what fueled his bilingualism. And so that's when kind of I started being like, connection is the heart of bilingualism. Like he wouldn't have done it for any other reason. Like he learned for, many years in school, but he didn't have a connection to the language that was physical, like that existed. And then our kid was born, and it was like, okay, I'm doing it for you. And now we speak Spanish to our kids full time.
So this actually brings me to, I'm getting a whole bunch of ideas for post-production of this, because I remember it was really heartfelt, the Father's Day post that you put for him. And he's speaking Spanish to your child, and y'all are I think he was cutting carrots or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I do have some friends who are speech pathologists who are originally monolingual, but for the same reason, they want to teach their children how to be bilingual so that way they can connect with the other side of the family. Yeah. And so what are some strategies, maybe even from your husband's perspective, if you can just think of some things that he says, to get over even the confidence? I think
I got you.
Yeah.
So I need to like make this public, but like, okay. Right. So and I just told this to my other friend who was like saying like, oh my God, I've taken like 7 years of Spanish. I've gotten a tutor and I just like cannot get over the hump. And I was like, okay, let me tell you what it is. You need to buy baby books in Spanish, books that have like 3 words for a sentence, and you need to read them out loud. Read them to yourself when like look at a mirror and you're reading to find a baby that you can read it to. Read 3 books a day, read 5 books a day, however many baby books. Read them over and over and over again, and you'll get more used to speaking the language out loud, because a lot of people will say they can read and write it better than they can speak it. And it's because the speaking opportunities they're always less. Like, who do we actually have to speak this language, with? And so that's why we need to find the person, that connection. And so for Brandon, it was reading. And so like I basically put away all of our books that we had that were baby English books and replaced them with baby Spanish books. And so then he started reading them, and he didn't say them right all the time. And that wasn't the point. It was to pronounce it correctly wasn't the point. It was to get used to and building that habit of reading in Spanish. And then the more he did it, eventually he started correcting himself and catching himself when he was reading something. And now he still reads the books in Spanish, and it's easier because it's a habit that you're building. And so I think reading, very simple things, like everyone could read I don't know. Like I can share a bunch of books too, but I have a book that it's just like verde, 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 el cocodrilo que muerde. And that's like the whole thing. And then the next one, it's like azul, 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 y se sube en un baúl. And it's like so simple. It's very repetitive. It's very easy to continue, that pattern. It's not good for like kids learning how to read, but it's good for you who already just wants to get more confidence in whatever I'm reading. And then another tip that I love for parents, is like changing your phone to Spanish so that way you're navigating it, because the more you use it, the more you're modeling to your kid that one, you're willing to learn, and that you're willing to make it hard for yourself too, because that's part of the more we put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, the more we can relate to bilingual people who are kind of trying. It's uncomfortable to like say something and you don't know if you said it right. And it's uncomfortable to try something and not know what other people's response is going to be. And so the more we put ourselves in that shoes, the more empathy we can create. And then also the more humility we gain from that experience. Music, I love music. I mean, there's people in other countries who like can't speak Spanish at all, but they can sing Romeo Santos, they can sing Aventura, they can sing Juan Luis Guerra, so like music is a very good tool. And a lot of times, like if you do baby music, it's like the same songs that you hear, like Oh McDonald's, you could hear that in Spanish, and you know what it's saying. You just have to learn the new words for it. It's like a synonym. That's what I always say. Like bilingualism, it's like I know this word, and they're the same to me. They're not like different. They don't live in different parts of my brain. They're like mixed in together, always like getting to know each other. And that's what I think gets in the way of people jumping into bilingualism, is that it's so hard to just be in a vulnerable state when you might not know, but your kid needs to see that. And that's good for your kid, that like, oh, my parent doesn't always know. And at some point, my kids will know more Spanish than my husband. And it's going to be like, exciting, I think, like he's gonna have to be like, okay, well, how do you say that? Like, how do you say that, or explain that to me, or show me to me? And they're gonna be the teachers then. And that's part of the fun. That's part of the bilingual journey. There's words I don't know in English, and my husband needs to like teach me, or context I never had because I grew up in a different country and I didn't grow up here. So it's like a very different life perspective, but music, baby books, your phone, watching things in Spanish. My husband loves TV.
Okay.
Loves it. Like he loves it a lot. He like his favorite thing would be like to just watch a movie every day. He loves movies, and so like he watches like kids movies that he watched growing up in Spanish, or shows in Spanish, and that has helped him a lot too.
Oh wow. And I'm sorry, my niece is my what, baby?
Lotion.
My lotion, yes. Yes, you could use my lotion. Like crawl on the ground and let me know. Okay. Well, Diandra, that does bring me to a quick story I want to tell. Can I share a story?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I am relatively new bilingual. So even saying it, I have to have the confidence to even say, yes, I'm a bilingual SLP. And when I am treating patients, it is in Spanish. I can say I'm a bilingual SLP. But since I grew up monolingual, I've been monolingual my whole life. I just had the experience of learning Spanish these past 2 years and actually implementing it in my profession. I feel like a baby. So even some of what you've recommended is nice for me. But one point I wanted to say was when I went to Guatemala to learn Spanish and go to Spanish school, a few things came up for me, and it dealt with how we interact with our monolingual Spanish parents. And I was learning Spanish, so used to speaking English. I mean, I still knew Spanish relatively, but like you said, it's harder to communicate. It's just a lot harder. And I'm just like, this is so frustrating. I felt so frustrated. I felt incredibly frustrated. And it made me a lot more humble. I'm like, this is exactly what parents are feeling, because they have real issues. All I want to ask is, where is this store that I want to go to? Or where is, I'm just trying to ask those basic questions. Can I get a towel? That was something I had no idea how to say. But parents are trying to communicate needs that their family, that their children have.
Mm-hmm.
So I do appreciate you coming onto the show and even speaking about that perspective, because I don't know. I think that we have a lot of assumptions.
We do. And we think it's so much easier. Like, it's so funny because when people say like, oh, well, why don't they learn English? Like when I say like my family doesn't, like my parents don't speak English, people are like, oh, what? Well, they've lived in the US for X years. Why don't they learn English? And I was just like, why don't you learn Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
Like, tell me what got in the way of you learning another language, because you're also monolingual. Like, they're monolingual, you're monolingual. So tell me what got in the way for you to learn. And then when you think about what got in the way, apply that. And then think about them being an immigrant. Think about their positionality compared to you. Like, we can't, it's not the same. And we don't, well, it is the same, but we don't treat it as the same. When a monolingual English speaker is asking why another person doesn't speak English, the question is, why are you not bilingual? You're asking them to be bilingual, but you're not also bilingual. Like, come on, cut them a break. You didn't learn either. Either you didn't have a function for the language. It wasn't valuable to you. It wasn't a need. It wasn't a necessity. People become bilingual for people, for a connection, or for a necessity, which is also rooted in connection. A lot of, if you ask a lot of first generation children, we have had to translate for our families. We have had to, do things for our families a lot younger than other people that are monolingual and didn't have to do that with their families. And so for us, that is not only, we feel proud about that, but that is what keeps us going. And it's also that connection point for all of us. And when we find each other, that's what we connect about. Like, oh my God, when I was little, I did this. I would help my grandma when she needed to make a doctor's appointment. She would be like, oh, can you call and you make this appointment? Ask for a translator. Why did you ask for a translator? She said, no, they don't give it to me. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to call then because I'm going to call and I'm going to let them know that they need to give you a translator. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes, it's like those things that for us, we feel empowered and confident, and we can say that because we're more educated on how the system works. But I can't blame my grandma for not feeling comfortable asking for a translator because she knows how her system is. I know how my system is, but she knows what it's going to be like if she asks for it versus if I ask for it, which is what you're saying. Like, we need to normalize asking for a translator, but it's not always well received. And so, but I know that they won't give me the same pushback because I am speaking English to them. You know what I mean? And so I think that it's a humbling experience when you put yourself. So I'll tell you a quick story related to you. So when I moved to upstate New York, I didn't know how to drive, and I was 24. I learned how to drive when I had my license, but I never practiced because I lived in New York City. And then I moved to upstate New York where everybody drives and it is the norm. And my husband had been driving since he was 16, which I thought was ludicrous.
Right.
But I was then a 24-year-old needing to drive. And I remember how intimidating it was to like just drive. And then the winters were so bad. And it was so intimidating. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, imagine, I speak English, I have a license, I have all these things. Imagine moving to this country, not speaking the language, not even having a car, not having all these things. It would be extra hard. And so, like, the more we think about, like, oh my God, this is hard for me, imagine how hard it is for this, the more we can, I think, have better relationships and better understanding of what our families are really going through. Or at least I have a place where I can park my car, have a driveway. Some people don't have that. Some people have to pay, like when we go to New York City, we have to pay for parking, which is insane to us because we always have a driveway, but you have to think about, okay, so, and I'm like, oh my God, I pay this and I can afford it. Imagine people that can't afford it and have to park their car. Like and they can't get rid of their car because they have so many people in their families, and buying a Metro card would be insane. So it's easier to have the car, but then they have to, and so you have to think about context and how that applies to other people and not just be so into yourself and your situation that works for you, but doesn't work for your client and doesn't work for other people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. This, whole episode needs to be a book. Honestly, can we just put this into a book?
Can we just send it to the publisher? Someone make this a thing. Yes.
Like, please, please do. Well, Diandra, I am looking forward to future conversations with you. Where can people find you if they want to ask you more?
Yes. Instagram is the best place to find me. I am on TikTok and I am in other places on Twitter, but I'm not active on anything. I just have like my handle, but it's just Bilingual Play Date all together on Instagram. You can always message me. I respond to all my DMs. And if I don't respond, just message me again. But I usually respond to everybody. And you can either DM me or comment on my post. I'll definitely have a conversation with whatever you need. I'll point you to the right resources. If you go on my page, there's like a brochure looking thing. And when you click on it, it's guides. And I have guides for everything. I even have a guide for up your Spanish. Like if you're wanting to work on your Spanish, these are 9 strategies and I have them all listed. So feel free to go on my page and check that out. I would love to connect with whoever is out there that's wanting to raise bilingual children or is in a service provider role and is wanting to be more helpful than cause harm. Because I think that sometimes in our professions, because we're the helping professions, we think that we're helping, but sometimes the way that we're helping is actually harmful. And I love to have those conversations as well with people.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to shout out people who stayed in the audience. We have Maria Romero. It's so good that you came. I'm so happy to see you. And Ingrid came as well. She's excellent. You're sending with a lot of love.
Yes, I love them so much. Love it, love it.
Well, thank you so much, Diandra. And I am looking forward to next time. I'm going to go ahead and end this live.
Yes.